Hey, Money Crew. Welcome to the Locums Lounge. Are you a physician who is feeling burned out? Are you tired of working endless hours without having the opportunity to reboot and recharge? Do you wish you could negotiate more money and work on your own terms? Are you interested or kind of heard of locum tenens work but aren't quite sure where to get started? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then let me be the first to tell you that this podcast is just for you. I am your host, Dr. Mimi, board-certified emergency medicine physician, locum tenens expert, and full-time locums doc. I am also your take-back coach. This podcast will inspire you to take back your career and practice medicine on your own terms. I will help you to successfully develop the strategies that will help you break free from the mindset that you work for your job and instead take back your career and let your job work for you. You can be happy while practicing medicine. You can avoid burnout, and yes, you absolutely can make more money. All right, well, let's get into it. Hello, this is Dr. Mimi. It's been a while. I am definitely happy to be back with you and sharing another episode of the Locums Lounge. So let's talk about where have I been? It's been about 3 months since my last episode was posted, and that was not intentional. Definitely not intentional. I had a devastating loss back in September. It was one of my older cousins who was essentially in the prime of his life. It's about a 10-year age difference, but what I realized and learned about him that I didn't know is that he truly was a hard worker. He worked for himself, and he had a ton of other people who looked up to him. That got me to thinking about my life. Am I truly doing everything that I love? And so that leads me to this episode and what I want to talk to you about today. So this situation really got me to thinking. During this time of my life, I had started my podcast. I quit a administrative job earlier in the year. But in lieu of the administration job, I took on another part-time job from home. And I thought working from home should be great. I get to spend time with my son, and it provided a sense of security. But I will tell you, that sense of security came with the price. I was completely exhausted from trying to keep up with this part-time job I had at home. And even though I started my locums business and felt really good about what I was doing in terms of taking control of my career, I had this one thing that was hanging over my head that added to frustration and unhappiness. I took that job because I wasn't 100% sold on myself. I thought I still need that stability of having a job, a real job, so to say. And so when I experienced this devastating loss, I decided that I needed to really restructure what I was doing, restructure my time. And I'm really big on buying back your time. When I started looking at the time invested versus the payoff from what I was doing, it did not add up. And so thankfully, December 1st, I am without that burden of working at home. Because what I know about myself is that when I'm at home, I don't want to work. If I am working, I don't want it to be the type of job where I have to push my kid away because he doesn't understand what I'm doing. I don't want to have a job where I'm at home working, but I'm really not at home. So this year, I essentially quit 2 jobs. And when I thought about it, that was like the first time I've ever quit a job, and I did it twice this year. One thing for sure, quitting a job isn't easy. And I bring that back to how we were trained in medical school, what type of mentality we were conditioned to have. We were selected because we have that go-getter, don't quit type of mentality. And that kind of hurts us later in life. Remember when you were in med school, or maybe this is past your time, but when I was in medical school and going into residency, there was a big change in resident work hours. And I remember listening to the senior residents ahead of me talk about how we were going to be terrible doctors because of these resident work hours, a reduction in resident work hours, and that we didn't have enough time to really learn because we're getting reduced hours. And I remember thinking, part of me was like, well, thank God that happened before I got into residency. And then a little bit of me thought, wow, oh my gosh, I only have so much time to become a good doctor because we can't work as much as they used to work. And there was this guilt, but it came from up top because the main people complaining about the reduced resident work hours are the people who were enforcing these long hours, or, essentially the people who had gone through that in their training. And so it was like this trickle down effect of, oh my gosh, you guys aren't going to be good because when I was a resident, I stayed at work, I lived in the hospital, I did this. And what we learned is that we're still okay, even with this reduction. We're still, coming out as competent physicians able to do our jobs, and it didn't require us to live inside the hospital. But why did we defend that? That was clearly abuse. And I think that mentality also trickles into our work mentality when we become attendings. We start our careers with a mentality that we have to prove ourselves, that we have to prove our worth to the organization that we're working with. Sometimes that means taking the shitty shift or working the shitty hours or taking more call, or it means that you're working the extra holidays. You're helping, and there's nothing wrong with helping a colleague out. I definitely believe in camaraderie and being there for your colleagues when it's necessary. But when it's a repetitive thing where you are finding yourself working longer hours, taking more call, and it's affecting your happiness, you're feeling burned out, then that's when it becomes a problem. But sometimes we would rationalize that as if I'm the new person, like I have to work this shift, or I'm the new person, I have to work the nights, I have to work the holidays. So we constantly make excuses for the type of abuse that we're going through in our workplaces. And I think that is a trickle down effect of conditioning that we have received through medical training. So reflecting on what I went through just to come to the decision to quit the first job and then quit the second job that I took after I quit the first job, I went through a lot, and it took a lot of rationalizing to say to myself that it was okay for me to walk away from either of these jobs, that I would still be okay, that I wasn't a failure, that I wasn't letting anybody down, that I wasn't giving up on myself, that I still brought value to whatever it was that I decided to do. And I felt so relieved after I walked away, because all of those things that were bothering me were affecting my personal life. That meant more to me than staying in that job. And so what I'm finding, talking to different colleagues, is that we feel this need to be loyal to a particular job, even if it's not satisfying us, even if it's causing you to be miserable. Like, we still feel a sense to be loyal to them. And it takes a lot to come to the decision to just quit. So I'm finally able to put a name to this. Some people may not agree, and maybe this is not the case for everyone, but I did some research, and this sort of feels like Organizational Stockholm Syndrome. I know we know what Stockholm Syndrome is, and maybe it's not that dramatic, but when you add the word organizational to the beginning, it makes you think about it a little differently, right? So I looked up the definition of Organizational Stockholm Syndrome, and essentially it's a process that is often seen in businesses and results in low performance due to, number one, stress, number two, lack of inspiration, and number three, poor creativity. So going back to the example of resident work hours, the reason why there needed to be a decrease in resident work hours is because residents were tired. They were making mistakes. You know, it was stressful. And that can't leave you inspired to do the work that you're doing if that's what you think life is being exhausted, being stressed. And then you have the stress of trying to perform at 100%, but you can't perform at 100% because the reality is your brain is not in a space to be on point. If you're tired and you're overworked, you're not getting sleep, and you're expected to make decisions on someone's life, you cannot possibly do that with the clarity that is necessary. And so that is part of the reason why resident work hours are reduced. So think about that in the context of this Organizational Stockholm Syndrome. That's exactly what happens when people are overworked and tired. Low performance. That's what it means. You get a low performing employee. So the other part of this is that the employees defend the behavior. They defend the harmful behavior. And so that is what I remember going through residency, is that the attendings who were upset about these reduced work hours were defending what had been done to them and felt like it needed to trickle down to everybody who came through medical training, is that you need to work these hours in order to be good. And so that's a form of defense. So fast forward into our lives as attendings where, now we really have an option to deal with whatever we're going to deal with. Like we sign up for whatever we're signing up for, and we set the boundaries, or we have the power to set those boundaries, but still allow some of this abuse to occur in our current jobs. So number one, it's stressful. So the things that are taking place in the workplace now with, staffing issues and, nursing shortages and, the fact that we don't have enough beds in the hospital because we don't have enough staff to take care of the patients in those beds, and just lack of resources leads to stress. And we have to push through it because what else is there to do? Part of it is, yes, nobody wants to do this work anymore. And so that leads to not having the manpower to fill those positions. But some of it is the fact that when we do get people in those positions, they're overworked and they leave. They don't want to work those jobs. Our ancillary staff, our techs, they get tired when there's only, one or two techs to do a job that requires 4 or 5. They end up leaving, but then that trickles down to the rest of the organization. And not just techs. I'm speaking in terms of nursing. I'm speaking in terms of EVS. I'm speaking in terms of pretty much every piece of the machinery that keeps us afloat. It all leads to stress on everyone else in the organization, at least the ones on the front line. What other ways does this affect us? Well, pandemic was a prime example. Stress of not having enough patients coming into the hospital meant that the physicians had to take pay cuts. They had to take cuts in, their hours, reduction of their benefits. And so here it is, we're doing the same work. We got the same bills, but now we have to work more to make up for what's taken from our pockets. It means more hours, which leads to stress. As if the pandemic wasn't stressful enough. So let's check the box. Let's say that Organizational Stockholm Syndrome, it does result in stress, low performance due to stress. And it comes from the systems in place in our workplace. All right, moving on. Lack of inspiration. What does that look like for a doctor? Lack of inspiration. When I think about a prime burned out physician, let's say maybe it's not you. Maybe you're blessed and it's not you. Maybe it's somebody you know. Maybe it's a consultant that you see. When you think about lack of inspiration, what does that look like? I think it's manifest as how you do your job. If you're not inspired to do your job, and what we do is take care of patients, you have physicians who are rude to their colleagues. And maybe that's just their personality, or maybe it's the fact that they're burned out. Maybe this organizational Stockholm syndrome is affecting their ability to function as their true self. That results in how you interact with your colleagues and your patients, and whether those are positive interactions. I think that's a good example of lack of inspiration. You don't feel motivated as you did when you were bright-eyed and started medical school and did your interview and told everybody that you wanted to help people. Think about that person and think about the person who's burned out and how they approach their job. And that's not to say that everyone experiences that, because you can still be burned out, but maybe that's the one thing that you keep is, I'm going to make my patients feel like they mattered. I'm going to make my patients feel like I took the time for them. But for everybody, it's not like that. I've heard patients complain about other physicians and how rude they were and how they didn't explain things and how they were in the room and out and how they answered their questions very curt. And to me, that just says like, I'm trying to meet this expectation. Maybe it's the productivity expectation that is put on us, that you don't have time to spend that moment with the patient to try to explain or answer their questions or go back and tell them what's wrong, why they need to be admitted, why they're being discharged. So let's check the box on lack of inspiration and think about the ways that that manifests as a result of burnout and Organizational Stockholm Syndrome. All right, the last thing, poor creativity. I had to really think hard on this one because when you think of doctors, you don't think of creativity. But let's think about it. Let's figure out how does that check the box? Poor creativity. Maybe you're not the person who thinks about processes or wants to get involved in the first place, but let's say that you were someone who, felt like your input can make a change. Let's say that you're at a place where you get appointed to different committees. Let's say, at one point in your career, you would have been happy to work on these committees and you would have been, excited to, figure out how you can contribute to the organization. But then somewhere it became a burden, and it's like, you don't want to be tasked with another thing. You don't want to have another burden, responsibility, task to be involved with, another meeting, another, list of things to do, another thing on your list of things to do. I mean, like, you just don't want to be bothered. You don't want to get involved. You don't want to contribute to any additional activities that can improve your place of work. And there could be other examples, but I'm just trying to think of what applies in this circumstance of lack of creativity. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. If there's any other ways that lack of creativity manifests as being a doctor who has been affected by Organizational Stockholm Syndrome. So where does the defense come in? So the defense comes in where we essentially work on those committees, even though we don't want to, and you feel compelled to be a part of that, even though that's not something that you are inspired to do. And you do it anyway, instead of learning to say no. Like, it is okay to say no. But I think we as doctors feel like we can't say no. We shouldn't say no, even if it goes against what we really feel inspired to do or not to do. Where else does that defense come into play? Being understanding of our circumstances and just trying to, really make excuses for why things are the way they are. Maybe the organization should pay people more money to do those jobs. If we don't have enough techs, maybe it's because it's not worth it to them. If we don't have enough nurses, maybe we need to find the extra money to pay them. Maybe we need to get paid the extra money ourselves, but we kind of make excuses for that by saying, we haven't returned to our pre-COVID volumes, and we let that be a a reasonable excuse to accept less than what we deserve. And a lot of doctors are not really happy with that excuse, but we're understanding. They tell us that, and it's like, okay, we have to put up with this. We have to deal with this. So I think that's where we are accepting of the abuse that we take. Where does the defense also show up? When you're making it okay to work long hours, where you're making it okay to work those extra holidays, or where you're making it okay for, well, they're shortening my hours, so I have to take this. And once they do it and get used to it, it's like, okay, why should we go back to what we used to do? And we're okay with that. We just accept it. At least some of us do. Because we feel obligated to that organization, or we feel that we won't get our bread and butter from anywhere else. So maybe it's a highly critical descriptor for what we go through as doctors. Maybe it's not exactly as dramatic, but there are a lot of similarities in how we rationalize staying in a place that is taking advantage, how we rationalize being in a situation that does not serve us well. So what do you do about that? How do you take control of that? How do you work in these sorts of conditions? I can only tell you what I've done. I can only tell you that having control over your career makes you look at this a lot differently. So, for instance, I used to be a doctor who was tired. Like, I come home tired, I wake up tired. All I had to do was go to work, come home. The shifts that I had were not shifts that I desired. But I felt like I had to do those shifts because I was the new person. And, this particular group of people worked the same shifts that they worked probably for the last 20 or 30 years. And so I didn't feel empowered to say, hey, this doesn't work for me. And when I did feel empowered to do it, I was pretty much on my way out the door. But one of the things that someone said to me is that if you have to go through all this just to, make it comfortable for you to stay, then it's going to be something else, and you're going to stay longer than you really should have. So I spoke up, and there was a little inch given, and that little inch made me stay a little bit longer than what I really should have stayed, because at that point it was like, this is not working. So you have to think about it. When you're on your way out the door, what is the first thing your employer tries to do? Oh, well, let us do this, but you've already abused me. So then we rationalize, well, they're going to just let me work days now, or they're going to just let me work a certain number of shifts now. But then when you think back, is that really enough change to make you stay? Is that vacation time enough that makes you want to stay? Do you come back a different person? Not really. You really don't. It just makes you stay in a situation longer than you should. And eventually you still end up leaving, or something else happens. So how did I overcome this? For one, I started to set some boundaries of what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. And I started to look for ways to make a positive change in those areas. And the positive change for me was to start my locums business, to start working as an independent contractor who maintained my own schedule, maintained my own hours, decided what holidays I was going to work and what I wasn't going to work, and decided what pay was acceptable for me. What amount makes it worth my while to put up with all the organizational trickle down of negativity that ends up in our workplace? What makes it worth it for me? Because maybe I can't make a change. Maybe, that's not my ministry to try and change the whole system. But in order for me to pay my bills and go home and live a good life, what does that mean? For me, that meant starting my locums business. For me, that meant starting a podcast so that I can share this knowledge with other physicians. For me, that meant starting a coaching business so that I could coach other doctors who want to take control of their careers and don't want to end up in that spiral of potential burnout. For you, it could mean transitioning to part-time. It could mean going PRN. It could mean doing part-time locums. It could mean starting a bakery. Like, for you, it can mean anything. But I challenge you to figure out what it is that you're missing, what it is that will help you to either do your job as a doctor at 100% versus showing up tired, burned out, resenting your decision. It's possible. It's possible that you can end up in that space, but it's also possible that you can turn it around. It's possible that you can turn it around and make it more meaningful to you. I look at doctoring as a means to an end. I love what I do. I love the excitement of being an ER doctor. I love taking care of patients. I love making a change in their lives. And even with the negative experiences, I love that God uses me to try and make a difference in that person or that family's lives. Even if it's just comforting a person after they've had a loss. I look at my job as being very important, and I know that I was chosen to do this, that God put this in my heart. But I also know that this is not the only thing that defines me. I know that there are other things that are important to my life that I do have the power to explore. One thing that I learned from my cousin's passing is that whatever you do, you have to do it with a passion. It has to be something that God led you to, and it should be something, more than it has to be, but it should be something that God leads you to, because that's where you're going to get your most fulfillment. And that's where you're going to make your biggest impact. And so this is how I am making an impact. And I promise not to leave you guys for so long. So I appreciate you joining me on the Locums Lounge. And please feel free to reach out, ask questions, tell me you agree, tell me you disagree. Let's have a discussion. Until next time, enjoy your week. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Locums Lounge with Dr. Mimi. I hope that you leave feeling inspired to at least consider how locums can change your lifestyle as you practice medicine. Be sure to check out my website at thelocumslounge.com and follow us on Instagram at The Locums Lounge. Look forward to hearing from you next week, and thank you for tuning in. Until next time, have a great week.